Hello everyone, Patricius Giovanno here, now with another research topic. We are going to talk about research design. Okay, let me show you my PowerPoint slides. Here we go. So today's topic is research design, and this refers to my book published in 2015, chapter 3, pages 41 up to 89. So you can read those pages in order to prepare for this lecture. Once again, let me remind you of your thesis chapters. Uh, as usual, you will see that your thesis will consist of 5 chapters. Chapter 1, Introduction. Chapter 2, Review of Related Literature. Chapter 3, Method and Data Collection. This is what we are going to talk about today. And then you have findings and conclusions and suggestions. Okay. Now, first of all is the definition of research design. Research design is actually your plan to collect or gather the data and to analyze the data. So if you write it properly on your thesis, readers will know how you are going to collect the data and how you are going to analyze the data. So first of all, let's be clear about what your research design is and state it properly in your proposal or in your report so that everybody knows what you are going to do with the data collection and how you are going to analyze the data. So let me introduce you to the first research design. It is called exploratory or descriptive. It is called exploratory because basically you explore an issue into some depth, yeah, or you describe an issue, phenomenon in a certain context, and then you discuss that. So again, the aims is to describe condition, features, characteristics, attitude of a group of people or objects. For example, you can describe the speech acts in a movie dialogue. You can describe the politeness strategies in a debate. This is interesting. So if you watch a debate, you would see how each of the participants argue strongly but still maintain politeness. Another example is minor sentences and advertisements. You will learn about minor sentences when you take a class from me, discourse analysis. And then you can also describe students' learning strategies, students' reading abilities, etc. So the main point is you describe those things. Yeah. And in order to describe the phenomenon, you can use a range of instruments. You can use questionnaires, yeah, like here, questionnaires. You can interview people. You can interview your respondents. You can give them some tests, yeah. Or you can observe. You can observe their behavior. You can observe the way they do things, guided by an observation guideline. And these are the means to collect the data in exploratory or descriptive research. Now, this is another design. It is called survey. Survey means mainly aims to describe a certain characteristics of a group of people and then to generalize the result to a larger population to which the group of those people belong. See, this is the essence of a survey. Yeah. So, for example, you have a population here consisting of 400 people. You have 100 people here, 200 people here, and 100 people here. This is called the population. But you are not going to gather the data from this population because you simply don't have the means. You simply don't have the time or the energy to gather the data from this large number of people. So you have to select only some of them. And those are the people who are called your sample. Yeah. So you distribute questionnaires and you gather the data from your sample. And then once you have done that, you will generalize the result to the larger population. Yeah, so for example, you decide to take only these people, 100 people out of 400 people, and then you interview them, you give them questionnaires, you test them, and then once you have found the finding, once you have analyzed the data, you can generalize that to the 400 people here. Generalize means saying that whatever applies to your sample also applies to the larger population. Okay. So say, for example, you have a population of 400 students, you take a sample of only 80 students, and you test them TOEIC. And then you find out that the result is their average score is 800, which is very high on TOEIC. So you can generalize this to the 400 students, to the whole population. You can say that I conclude that the population also has high ability on TOEIC. Now that's survey. Yeah. From sample, you identify a certain characteristic in a sample, and then you generalize that to a population. Okay. So what is essential or what is very important in a survey is sampling. Sampling means the act of taking some people from the larger population. And there is a schematic way of doing that. Yeah. So in order to generalize properly, you must use what is called random sampling. Yeah, random sampling here. This is a very important keyword, random sampling. This is the act of taking some people out of the population by a systematic and calculated manner. So you just cannot go to a population, to a group of people and say, okay, you and you and you become my sample. That's not very systematic. That is not certainly not random, and so that is bad. Yeah. So you can use the random number generator on Google. You can search Google. You can search for that random number generator on Google. Just type in the random number generator on Google search, and then it will give you plenty of applications or software. Most of them are free, by which you can generate random number. And once you have got the random number, you can decide which people, which subjects will become the member of your sample. Yeah. This is random sampling. The essence of random sampling is every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected as sample. This is important. Every member must have equal chance of being selected as sample. And in random number generator, it is guaranteed that you will take care of this very important criterion. Yeah. All you need to do in using the random number generator is to input the number of the population and the number of the size of your sample, how many people will be involved in your sample, and then it will process the input and it will give you some numbers by which you can select the number of the population to become the member of your sample. That's the idea. Okay. Now, purposive sampling is another type of sampling, but this is typical in a case study or in a descriptive research. It is not in survey. When you are doing descriptive research or case study, you may use purposive sampling. What is purposive sampling? Purposive sampling is you select your sample based on a certain criteria that are needed or that are relevant to your research topic. Okay, so only those people who meet your criterion will be your sampling, will be your sample. Yeah. So, for example, you want to investigate, you want to study the reading ability of female students who come from small cities in East Java. Now, in order to do this, you have to take a sample, right? But your sample must meet certain criterion, namely that they have to be female. Yeah, they have to be female students, and they must come from small cities in East Java. So if you meet a member of a population and he happens to be a male, then he is out. You cannot choose him as a sample. Why? Because he's not female. Because he doesn't meet your requirement. Yeah. And you run into another person again. This time, it's a female. It's a female student, but she comes from Surabaya. No way. You cannot pick her as the member of your sample. Why? Because although she is female, but she comes from Surabaya, which is not a small city in East Java. Yeah. So you see, in purposive sampling, you must define your criterion by which you are going to select the sample. Now we come to the third type of sampling, which is convenience sampling. This is actually when you select whoever you happen to meet, or any person who happens to be available for your studies. For example, you want to study reading habits, and then you can find only 5 people in a classroom, and then you decide, okay, you will become my sample. Yeah, that's convenient, right? But at the same time, it is the weakest form of sample. It is the worst type of sample because it hardly represents the whole population. Yeah, so remember that when you do your sampling, you know the rationale behind your sampling, and you must make sure that your sampling is strong. The sample should represent as much as possible the population to which it belongs. Okay, now the next design is what is called correlation. Before that, I will introduce to you the concept of variable. Variable is something that varies or differs from one subject to another and is the focus of your research. For example, age. Yeah. One person might be 20 years old, another person might be 21 years old, another person might be 30 years old. This is called variable because it varies from one person to another. TOEIC scores is also a variable because they can vary from one person to another. Yeah. Height, income, etc. Those are the things that might vary, that might be different from one person to another. Okay, so correlation design is aimed to determine whether two variables are correlated. What does it mean by correlated? Is whether an increase in one variable is accompanied by an increase in the other variable. So you want to find out if students score better in their TOEIC, is it accompanied by their better GPA at the end of the semester or at the end of their study? Yeah. If you want to find out whether that's the case, then it is a correlational design. Now there are some possible outcomes when you do a correlational study. One is you will find a positive correlation. Positive correlation means that an increase in one variable, an increase in one variable is accompanied by an increase in the other variable. So for example, the more vocabulary the students master, the higher or the better their English proficiency is. Increase here, increase in another variable. Negative correlation means an increase in one variable is accompanied by a decrease in the other variable. So, for example, the more vocabulary students master, the lower or the worse their English proficiency is. Yeah, so, increase here in one variable is accompanied by a decrease in another variable. That is negative correlation. The last possible outcome is there is no correlation, which means there is no definite pattern that you can establish. For example, some students may know more vocabulary but is low in English proficiency, but some other students may know more vocabulary and is better in English proficiency. So you cannot determine whether an increase on one variable is accompanied by an increase in another variable, or an increase here is accompanied by a decrease here. You cannot determine that. And if that's the case, it's called no correlation. Okay, now let me show you the possible outcomes of the correlations that I've just explained. So for example, you have a large positive correlation here. This is called a scatter plot diagram. So for example, this is the reading, this is the vocabulary mastery here on this axis. And then you have, this is the vocabulary mastery, and this is the English proficiency. So this is large positive correlation, means that students who score high on vocabulary mastery also tends to score high on English proficiency. Yeah. So an increase on one variable is accompanied by an increase in another variable, and that is a large positive correlation, and that's how it looks like when it is plotted on the scatter plot diagram. The second one is a medium positive correlation. Okay, about the large and the medium here, you are going to calculate it using a certain formula, and based on the result, you can say that it is medium or that is large. But I'm going to explain about that later. And in a small correlation, small negative correlation looks like this. Yeah, so students who score high on vocabulary mastery scores very low in English proficiency. If we plot his or her score, it is here. Yeah. And students who score low in vocabulary mastery happens to be very proficient in English. And that's where we put the score of that student. Yeah. So an increase in one variable is accompanied by a decrease in another variable, or vice versa. And if that's the case, if that happens in your calculation, then it is called negative correlation. And the diagram or the line will look like this. In positive correlation, it will look like this. And then there is another one. The last one that I've talked about is weak or no correlation. So here you cannot draw this line because the scores happen to be scattered everywhere here, like that. Yeah. You cannot draw a straight line. Unlike the former two, here you can draw a relatively straight line through all the scores that have been plotted on the scatter plot. Also here, you can still draw a straight line through all the scores that have been plotted on the scatter plot. But here, the scores are so much scattered that you cannot draw a line through them. And that is called weak or no correlation. Okay, and beware of this. Correlation may not imply cause and effect relationship. It only indicates relationship, not that one variable causes the other. Yeah. So when you do a correlational study, please do not conclude that one variable causes the other. That's wrong. Yeah. If you want to know whether there is a causal relationship, then you turn to experimental design. Okay. Now this is another design. It's called experimental. It aims mainly to see the effect of a certain treatment. A treatment here can be a new teaching method, a new aids for teaching, a new approach, a new textbook, a new apps, those kinds of things on a group of people or students. The effect of a certain treatment on a group of people or students. Yeah. So for example, the effect of visual aids on students' writing abilities, or the effect of teachers' storytelling on students' motivation, etc. In experimental design, you have to use two groups of students or two groups of subjects. First group is called the experimental group, and second group is called the control group. Then the experimental group receives a treatment, for example, storytelling. So every time they start a course or they start a lesson, the teacher will tell them a story. And also they will be asked to tell stories of their own. While the control group does not receive anything special, just teaching as usual. Yeah. After a period of time, for example, 1 semester or even longer than that, the two groups are tested in one skill, for example, motivation. Yeah. If the experimental group scores higher than the control group, you can conclude that your special treatment, that is the storytelling, is effective or has an effect on students' motivation. Yeah, because now you can see that the experimental group who are told to tell stories and who are told stories when they start the lessons turn out to have a higher motivation than the control group who does not receive that kind of treatment. So you can also say that the treatment here, the storytelling, causes the students' motivation, causes the students to have higher motivation. Now you can safely conclude that there is a causal relationship here. In experimental design, you can say that, you can conclude the causal relationship, but not in correlation. So if not, then the storytelling does not have any effect on the motivation. So if you find out that after the test year, both groups score similar to each other, then you can conclude that storytelling has no effect on their motivation. Yeah. Whether they are told stories or not, their motivation keeps the same. Yeah. It's the same. So there is no effect of storytelling on their motivation. In experimental design, ideally the treatment should last long enough. So if you have the luxury of time, if you can spend a few months, 3 or 4 months or even a semester in one school to carry out your experimental design, then that is even better. But in most cases, students do not have that time. They simply have only maybe 1 week or 2 weeks. Yeah, you can still do the experimental design, but of course with some limitations, which you have to acknowledge in your thesis later. Also, there is another requirement: the students should be randomly assigned to the experimental group and control group. Otherwise, you can use the what we call quasi-experimental design. This is a weaker version of experimental design. Okay, the next design is called content analysis. Content analysis aims to count the frequencies of certain linguistic usage in a spoken or written discourse or texts. And then you infer from it the characteristics of the speaker or the writer. So for example, you decide to study the frequencies of emotional expressions in a charismatic leader's speech. Sorry, I should have inserted the word speech here. The frequencies of emotional expressions in a charismatic leader's speech. You want to know how many times the leader, the charismatic leader, says something emotional, emotional expressions. Yeah, and then you can infer from the result the feature or the characteristic or even the personality of this charismatic leader. You can infer from the data whether the way he delivers the speech with emotional expressions might have an influence on his or her followers. Yes, it's going to be interesting if you can do a proper content analysis. Yeah. And then you have a development study. If you do this, you aim to develop a device or a new method or any other means that are designed to solve a particular problem in a certain context. So for example, you notice that in your school that you are working for, there is no systematic effort to teach math and foreign languages. Teachers are still grappling with how to teach these two skills. Yeah. Teachers do not have strong guideline and they are practically confused of how to do this. So you decide to do a developmental study. You want to develop a syllabus for teaching math and foreign languages to young learners. Now this is an example of a development study. In development study, you start with identification of the problem, and then you review a relevant theory or a set of relevant theories. And then you design the new means, you design the syllabus, in that case of the syllabus for teaching math and foreign languages. And then you try it out, you use it to teach a certain group of students. And then you evaluate the result. And then you improve the new syllabus or the new means or whatever you are developing based on the result of your evaluation. That is the essence of development study. Okay. Okay, students, so I think that's all my topic. I know that this probably sounds complex and complicated, but I hope that by reading my book, you can understand it properly. And by engaging in our discussion on MS Teams, you can deepen your understanding and you can have a clearer understanding of this research design. Okay.